He was standing across the street in the rain at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and he had no right to be there. I didn't know that yet. All I knew, walking back into my own building for a contract I'd left on my desk, was that I heard a sound coming from the executive floor that a building that size should never make after dark. I didn't know that sound would end with me tearing apart 10 years of my own life to save the woman who made it. I'll tell you what was in that gray sedan soon enough. First, you need to understand who I was before she walked into it. My name is Taejun Se. I was 34 years old that November, and I owned more of Chicago than my business card admitted to. Blackstone Meridian Holdings was the name people knew. Logistics, real estate, private security, a portfolio of subsidiary companies that together employed over 3,000 people across 6 states. It looked clean because I had spent a decade making sure it looked clean. What most of those 3,000 people never knew, what the board never knew, what even some of the men who worked directly for me only half understood, was that underneath that legitimate company sat something older and darker that I had inherited, expanded, and protected with a discipline that had cost me more than I ever let myself count. I kept a second phone. I had a man who could make problems disappear from the world entirely, quietly, permanently, and I had used him twice in 10 years when I judged the cost worth paying. I told myself I never lost sleep over those 2 times. That was a lie I was good at telling. I want you to remember that phone. I want you to remember what it could do. Because before this story is over, I'm going to tell you exactly what I almost used it for, and exactly why I didn't. But that night in November, none of that was on my mind yet. I was thinking about a contract revision 6 hours of back-to-back calls had made me too tired to trust myself with. That's the only reason I came back to the office. That's the only reason I heard her. It wasn't loud. It was the sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard, short broken breaths, a swallowed sob, the particular rhythm of crying that has been practiced into something almost manageable. I stopped in the hallway. In my world, an unexpected sound in an empty building at midnight meant one of 3 things, and none of them were good. My hand went for my phone out of instinct before my mind caught up to what I was actually hearing. Then I turned the corner and saw the lamp. One desk lamp, burning at the far end of the floor, throwing a small warm circle of light over Amara Whitfield. Her hands were pressed flat against her face. Her phone lay screen up on the desk beside her, lighting up over and over with a name I didn't recognize yet, a name I would come to know better than I ever wanted to. Calvin Rusk. I had known Amara for 18 months by then. In 18 months I had never once seen her cry. I had watched her manage a 3-continent scheduling collapse without raising her voice. I had watched her absorb a 40-minute call from the worst attorney in the city and come out of it with 2 clean pages of notes and a face so composed it was almost unsettling. She was 27. She had the kind of intelligence that didn't need to announce itself, and in 18 months she had never once made her problems anyone else's problem. Watching her fall apart in that small pool of light did something to me I wasn't prepared for. I almost said her name. Something in the shape of her stopped me. She hadn't heard me come in. She had a few more seconds of privacy, and some part of her clearly needed them badly. I took the contract from my desk by memory in the dark, and left the same way I'd come, without turning on a single light. I didn't know yet what I was walking away from that night, or how much of it had already been decided for both of us. The next morning she was exactly on time, coffee going, 2 calls already handled, the morning briefing on my desk before I'd taken off my coat. "Good morning, Mr. Seo." She looked fine. I want you to understand what that word cost her, because fine on Amara was a full-time performance. I let it go for 1 day. On the 2nd day I started watching, the way I'd learned to watch things in my other life, without ever looking like I was watching. I noticed she tracked the elevator every time the doors opened. I noticed her shoulders didn't fully drop until she'd accounted for everyone in the room. I noticed she ate lunch at her desk every single day, and I had always assumed that was ambition. I was starting to think I'd been wrong. Her phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. Calvin Rusk again. She went still for exactly 3 seconds, declined the call, and kept typing like nothing had happened. Her hands took longer than 3 seconds to stop shaking. I called Min-jae Kwon that night. Min-jae was 41, former military intelligence, and had run my security for 6 years, with a discretion that made him worth more to me than half the executives on my payroll. I gave him a name. He said he'd have something in 48 hours. He had it in 36. Calvin Rusk, 33, financial analyst, no criminal record on paper, nothing that explained the look on Amara's face. But Min-jae didn't deal only in what was on paper. A gray sedan had been parked across from our building for 11 straight days. Footage from a neighboring rooftop showed Calvin inside it for hours at a stretch, watching our entrance. 3 times in 2 weeks he had approached Amara on the sidewalk. Each time she'd turned back inside, or changed direction. Each time he'd followed half a block before stopping. He hadn't touched her. Not once, not on camera. And that was the part that told me everything, because I knew exactly what patient, organized, deniable pressure looked like. I had built half my career on it. I found her 4 days later standing at the break room window, arms crossed, staring at the city like she'd gone somewhere far away and wasn't sure how to get back. "You didn't eat lunch today," I said. She turned fast, that quick professional reset locking back into place a half-second too late for me to miss what had slipped underneath it. "I'm fine, Mr. Seo. I know you keep saying that." She looked at me for a long moment, weighing something. "Is there something you need from me?" "No," I said. "There isn't." I let her keep the lie one more day, because I hadn't earned the right to take it from her yet. That night, watching the security feed with Minjae, I saw Calvin park the sedan 40 minutes after Amara's scheduled end of day. Same as the previous Tuesday, same as the previous Thursday. The pattern assembled itself without effort, because it wasn't complicated. She was timing her exits around a man in a gray car she'd never told a single person about. She wasn't staying late because she was dedicated. She was staying late because she was afraid to go home. I picked up my phone to call the man who solved problems permanently. I want you to know that. I want you to know how close that call came, and how easily, in the life I'd built, it would have been the obvious answer. Then I put the phone down, because Amara wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a person in a situation she never asked for, and somewhere in 18 months I had stopped thinking about her as an employee whose crisis might create disruption for my company, and started thinking about her as someone whose hands I couldn't stop picturing, shaking on a desk, taking 3 seconds too long to steady. I had the sedan's plates run through channels that had nothing to do with anything official. I sat in my office until nearly 10, and 2 floors below, a car from my security team idled quietly near the exit she always used, without her knowing it was there. I told myself that was due diligence. I almost believed it. The next afternoon my direct line rang. 2 words from Minjae. "He's back." I was at the window in 4 seconds. The sedan sat exactly where it always sat. I made 2 calls, one about the garage access, one to my driver Daesu. And at 6:15 when Amara reached for her coat, I told her, without looking up, "Take the garage exit tonight. Renovation crew's been on the sidewalk." There was no renovation crew. She looked at me for a beat, then out the window at the darkening street, and something moved across her face, relief, and underneath it something rarer, the look of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long they've forgotten what it feels like for someone to notice the weight. "Okay," she said. "Just that." Calvin sat outside our building until 8 that night, watching doors that never opened, before he finally drove away. I called Minjae the following morning before I'd finished my first coffee. He went to her building last night, sat outside 40 minutes. Didn't go in. I set the coffee down and understood, in that moment, that this wasn't going to stop on its own, and I wasn't going to let it keep happening to her in silence. I found her on the rooftop terrace 3 days later, the one nobody used in November except me. "How long?" I said. She looked at me sideways. "How long? What? How long has he been showing up?" The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was someone caught, calculating how much ground to give. "A few months," she finally said. "Maybe closer to 5. 5 months. 5 months of timing her exits around a man in a gray car. 5 months of eating lunch alone at her desk, because restaurants had too many exits to watch. 5 months of telling no one." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "Because it's my problem," she said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone gripping something tightly, not someone actually calm. "That's why I drafted a resignation." "You're not resigning," I said. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said, "and I want you to understand." She was right to say it. I turned to her, more direct than I'd planned. "What do you want?" I asked. It caught her off guard. "I want to stop," she said finally, her voice dropping into a register that wasn't performance anymore. "I want to walk out of a building without checking who's across the street. I want to answer my phone without looking at the name first. I want to stop feeling like I did something wrong." "I trusted him for 4 years, she told me. "I thought I was a good judge of people. He went through my phone 2 years in. He wasn't angry, he wasn't shouting. He just asked who someone was, and I explained, and he apologized, and he said it came from love. 6 weeks later he had my email password. 6 weeks after that he was calling my friends. By the time I understood what I was in the middle of, I'd already built 2 years of my life around someone who thought he owned it. When I finally told him I was leaving, he grabbed my arm. I pulled away. He let go. He cried and told me he'd never do it again. I was already gone. 14 months, she said. That's how long it had been since she left him. 14 months, and he was still parked across the street from her office, still calling, still mapping the geography of her life, like her leaving had only ever been a temporary condition to be corrected. "I'll need Minjae to get a full account from you," I told her. "Every incident, every date, everything you have. You're not going to do anything without telling me first," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "I need that to be a real answer, not a polite one. It's a real answer." Her account ran 40 minutes and covered 11 months of documented incidents she'd been quietly recording on her own, some part of her already understanding she might need them someday. What Minjae found beyond her account was worse. Calvin had mapped the entire periphery of her life: a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, a dry cleaner she used once a month, her gym's parking structure, hundreds of messages calibrated to sit just under the line of an open threat. "He's not impulsive," Minjae said. "That makes him harder." I sat in my office at 9 that night, thinking about how easily I could make Calvin Rusk stop being a problem in a single phone call. And then I thought about what Amara had said on the rooftop. "You don't get to make decisions about my situation without asking me what I want." I put the phone down. I authorized legal counsel instead, a firm I used for sensitive matters, people who understood how to build a documented case without moving too fast to be believed. I told them to begin, but not to file anything yet. This is the part where I have to tell you I chose the harder path, and I want you to remember that choice, because it very nearly cost me everything I'd spent 10 years building underneath the surface of my own name. 3 weeks moved in something close to rhythm. Amara worked. The floor ran the way it always ran, but something had shifted between us that neither of us named out loud. She met my eyes with less guard. Twice that week she ate lunch across from me at the small conference table instead of alone at her desk, and neither of us commented on it, because commenting would have made it something she'd have to think about. The sedan disappeared for 9 days. Minjae reported it flatly. He didn't say the word optimism, because we both understood an absence like that only ever meant Calvin was adjusting. He was. On the 10th day the car came back, repositioned further east, a less direct line of sight, which meant he'd noticed our changes and recalculated around them. Amara had a board presentation that same afternoon, and walked out of it at 4:15 with color in her face I hadn't seen in weeks. The board had approved a restructuring she'd spent 2 months building the case for. She sat at her desk afterward, and for almost a full minute, did absolutely nothing. No keyboard, no phone, just breathing in something close to a smile. I crossed to her desk and set her unsigned resignation letter beside her keyboard. "I thought about accepting it," I said, "for about 3 seconds. Put it wherever you put things you don't need anymore." I went back to my office and heard, behind me, the quiet sound of paper being folded shut for good. That lasted until 6:18, when Minjae appeared in my doorway without knocking, which he never did unless the situation didn't allow for it. "He's in the building," he said. "Level 2 of the parking structure. A contractor credential we don't understand yet. Level 2 was the level Amara used every night now. I didn't take the elevator. I took the stairs, because stairs were faster, and fast was the only thing that mattered in that moment. Calvin was standing near the elevator bank when we came through, hands in his coat pockets, watching the floor indicator with the patience of a man who had decided he would wait as long as it took. He didn't look dangerous the way people expect danger to look. That was the most dangerous thing about him. "Mr. CO," he said, reasonable even. "I was hoping we could talk. 5 minutes with Amara, that's all." "This is a private facility," I told him. "You're trespassing on a stolen credential. She doesn't want to talk to you." Something cracked at the edges of his composure. "What documentation?" he said, when I told him what we had compiled. He hadn't known there was any. He had assumed everything he'd been doing existed only inside Amara's private fear, unwitnessed, unprovable. He was wrong, and watching that land on his face was the first time I understood exactly how far this man was capable of going once he realized the ground under him had shifted. He left without a fight, smart, which meant controlled, which meant he'd regroup. Behind me the elevator opened and Amara stood there with her coat over her arm, looking at the 2 of my men still posted near the exit ramp, looking at my face. "He was here," she said, "not a question." "I can't keep doing this," she said quietly, not defeat, just the flat factual sound of a person who has reached the actual edge of what she can manage alone. I drove her home myself that night, not Desu, me. She didn't argue, which told me more than anything she could have said. 11 blocks of silence before she finally spoke. "He knew which level," she said, "which means he'd been watching long enough to know we'd changed the route." "Yes, how long has he known?" "We don't know exactly." The answer came back the next morning, and it was worse than I'd braced for. The credential belonged to a contractor named Roderick Hayes, who'd sold it, not to Calvin directly, but through a buffer contact, and the money traced through 2 clumsy transfers straight back to Calvin's personal account. He hadn't just shown up. He had planned, arranged, and paid his way inside the one place Amara believed was contained. Here's the breadcrumb I want you to hold on to, because it comes back later and it changes everything. Minjae pulled every access log in the building and cross-referenced them against financial anomalies, and by 11 that morning we had a name. Portia Selby, 41, 7 years with the company, senior coordinator for facilities. A $4,000 deposit into her account 9 days earlier, traced to the same shell network Calvin had used to buy the credential. She'd been feeding him Amara's schedule for 4 months. 4 months, since before I'd even noticed anything was wrong. The gray sedan across the street had never been a man watching blind, he had always known. I have never wanted to hurt someone the way I wanted to hurt Portia Selby in that moment, and I want to be honest with you about that, because this is a story about restraint, and restraint isn't the absence of that feeling, it's what you do instead of it. I told Amara myself. She didn't cry. She sat with her hands folded on her knee, chin level, and took it the way you take something you already suspected the world was capable of. 7 years, she said, and I've been here 18 months, and she sold my schedule to him for $4,000. I used to bring her coffee from the cart downstairs. Black, 1 sugar. I did that for a year. That evening my second phone buzzed with a message I hadn't asked for. Package confirmed. Instruction when ready. Someone in my own organization had made contact on my behalf, anticipating what I would want done about Calvin Rusk, the way that world always anticipated the easiest answer. I sat with that phone in my hand for 30 seconds. I thought about Amara's hands on the break room window. I thought about what she'd said in the parking structure. I can't keep doing this, not a request to me, just a limit finally reached. I typed 3 letters back, not this. And I understood, putting that phone down, that I had just chosen the longer, harder, more exposed road, and that I was going to have to walk every step of it with the discipline of a man who'd built his whole life on the shorter one. The legal filing went in on a Monday morning. A protective order followed by afternoon, 300 feet, her home, her office, her person, violation now a criminal matter. Calvin didn't yet know it existed when Minjae's alert came through at 4:59 that same day. He'd walked through our own lobby, timed to a window when Amara was down there dropping off mail, away from the executive floor's control. I found them across the lobby, Amara backed against the reception desk, not cowering, but using it as a line between herself and a man standing 8 feet away, with his hands spread open in a rehearsed kind of harmlessness. "This is between me and Amara," he said when he saw me. "Nothing in this building is private from me," I told him. "She asked you to stop 14 months ago. You paid someone inside these walls for information about her movements." I watched something crack under his face that had probably always been there. And then Amara stepped past me. "Stop," she said, and it was the steadiest I had ever heard her. "Don't explain it. Don't tell me it comes from love. I've heard those explanations. I spent 4 years believing them. I don't want 10 minutes. I don't want a final conversation. I want you to stop. That's every single thing I want from you." Security walked him out. In the 3 steps before the revolving door took him, he turned and looked at her over his shoulder, with something in his face that hadn't been there before. Something past calculation, past the rehearsed reasonableness, into territory I recognized, because I had seen it in other men in other rooms, right before they stopped being careful. "He's never looked at me like that," Amara said quietly, watching the door. "He was served that night at a bar 4 blocks from his apartment. I want you to understand that I believed, for about 6 hours, that this was close to over. I was wrong, and the way I found out I was wrong is the part of this story that finally forced me to face the thing I'd been avoiding my entire adult life." Minjae called on a line he only used when his usual one wasn't safe. Calvin had gone to a contact in Pilsen, the kind of contact who dealt in private information for people who wanted leverage they couldn't get through conventional means, property records, business registrations. The kind of open-source digging that, with the right search terms, could start pulling threads on subsidiary companies that a thorough person might connect to operations my legitimate company's charter never covered. He was looking for something on me. I stood at my window 31 floors up and understood, in that moment, that Calvin Rusk had run out of ways to reach Amara through the front door, and had decided the fastest way back to her was to destroy the man standing in front of her. And he had gone looking in exactly the direction that could actually work, because underneath the version of me that people bowed to in boardrooms was a decade of decisions I had never let touch daylight. 3 subsidiary registrations, if pulled hard enough by the wrong person, led somewhere I had spent 10 years making sure no one could follow. I had built an empire on the principle that the two halves of my life would never touch. Calvin Rusk had just found the seam. I had two choices in front of me that night: get ahead of it, quietly, legitimately, and absorb whatever it cost me, or reach for the second phone one more time and make the exposure disappear the way I'd made problems disappear twice before in 10 years. I called my attorney instead and asked her to accelerate everything we had. I closed what could be closed inside the company that same night. And then, at 4 a.m, after a night I will not pretend was peaceful, I called Min Jae and told him I needed the full scope of everything, every operation, every entity, every piece of exposure, documented completely, not to hide it, to face it. He asked me what I was thinking. I told him the truth. I've been managing two lives for 10 years by keeping them separated, and they stopped being separated the moment Calvin Rusk walked into a bar in Pilsen, looking for a way to hurt someone I couldn't stand to lose. That decision is the real twist of this story, and I want to say it to you plainly the way it finally became plain to me at 4 a.m, with the city gray outside my window. I had built something powerful, and I had told myself for a decade that power was the thing that kept the people I cared about safe. What I understood that night was that it had never made anyone safe. It had only ever made me powerful. Those were not the same thing, and I had spent 10 years pretending they were. But before I could begin taking any of that apart, I still had a man standing on a Mars sidewalk with nothing left to lose. It happened 2 nights later. Min Jae's message was 4 words: he's at her building. I was in the garage before the words finished landing in my head, on the phone with Min Jae before the elevator doors closed. Our man on site had eyes on him. He hadn't approached the entrance yet, he was on his phone. I drove 8 minutes through wet streets that, for once, cooperated with everything I needed from them, and when I turned onto her block, the front door of her building was standing open, and Calvin was inside the entry alcove, speaking through the intercom panel. The door was open, he was inside. I don't know how long you've been waiting for the moment in this story where the two halves of my life finally stood in the same place at the same time, but that was it, on a wet sidewalk in November, with a man who had spent 5 months turning a woman's ordinary life into something she had to survive. I need to talk to her, Calvin said when he saw me, and the composure that had carried him through every previous encounter was gone. What was underneath it was raw, unmanaged, the voice of a man who had spent the day pulling on every thread he had and finding none of them led anywhere. You don't understand what you've done, he told me. You're not protecting her. You're making this worse. There are things I haven't been able to explain to her. There's nothing to explain, I told him. She was clear in that lobby. Whatever you think you're owed, she doesn't want it. That's not your decision, he said. It's not mine, I told him. It's hers, and she made it. I sent Amara a text before she reached the lobby. Stay on your floor, door locked, police 4 minutes out, and I watched the elevator indicator on the panel behind the glass stop its descent and hold on 3. She had listened. That single decision, hers alone, was the only reason what happened next stayed contained to a sidewalk instead of spilling into a lobby I couldn't control. You took her from me, Calvin said, quiet now, the anger gone soft, which is sometimes worse than loud. She was already gone before I ever met her, I told him. Whatever you're trying to get back wasn't there when you arrived. A siren, distant, growing closer. He heard it. Something in his face finally settled, not dramatically, just a slow collapse from a position he'd been holding for 14 months. He didn't fight the officers when they came. He looked up once at the lit third-floor window before they put him in the car, and whatever was in his face in that moment, I still don't have a clean word for it, and I've decided I don't need one. He's gone, I texted her. Police have him. You're safe. Okay, she wrote back. 1 word. I looked up at that window a long time before I finally drove home. I want to be honest with you about what wasn't over that night, because the arrest of Calvin Rusk was never the real ending of this story. The exposure Min Jae had traced to Pilsen still existed in databases that didn't care whether the man looking for them was in a holding cell or not. Somewhere in the days that followed, I had to decide whether I was still willing to be the man in the mirror I'd been looking at for 10 years. I didn't sleep that night. At 4 a.m, I called Min Jae and told him I wanted a compliance firm found, not my usual attorney. Someone entirely outside the existing structure, someone who specialized in unwinding exactly the kind of thing I had spent a decade building. He was quiet a long time on the other end of that call. Tae-jun, he finally said, do you understand what this will cost? I know what it'll cost, I told him. I've been running the calculation for 10 years on whether the structure was worth the price. I think I've been running it wrong the whole time. I met a compliance attorney named Thomas Gerber the following week in an office with no connection to any of my usual addresses, and I told him everything, the subsidiary chain, the history, the shape of it. He asked me one question that mattered more than any other. Why now? He said. What changed? Someone who shouldn't have been anywhere near the exposure nearly was, I told him. That's not the whole answer, but it's the honest one. We started a 60-day audit. I read every page of it myself, alone, over a weekend at my kitchen table, and understood by the end of it something I hadn't let myself understand in 10 years, that what I had built had made me powerful, and that the thing making Amara safe had never once been the power. It had been the choice, every single time, to use it or set it down. I had finally started choosing to set it down. Calvin's case moved through the courts that winter. A conditional sentence in the spring, no incarceration, but 3 years of supervision, mandatory counseling, a permanent order, a record that would follow him through every background check for the rest of his life. It wasn't the ending with music that people imagine when a story like this closes. It arrived instead on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, at a desk covered in a budget proposal, Amara holding her reading glasses in both hands and saying only, "Is it over?" "As much as it can be," I told her. "He'll have to choose to make it more than that." 3 weeks after that, she stood in my doorway with her resume in her hand and asked to be considered for the Director of Executive Operations role she'd already been doing the work of for months. I authorized the review panel that same day and stayed entirely out of the process because she had earned every inch of the answer on her own, and she was appointed that May on a bright ordinary morning that she didn't celebrate with anything louder than sitting down at her new desk and starting the day exactly the way she started every day. The last subsidiary in my old structure closed that same spring. On a Friday afternoon I didn't mark with anything at all. 3,200 people, employed in operations that were, for the first time in a decade, entirely clean. I signed the authorization, went home, and sat with the particular weight of a completed thing, not light, not triumphant, finished, the way only finished things are finished. I want to close every loop I opened with you tonight. The second phone was decommissioned that same spring, along with everything it had ever been used for. Portia Selby was gone within a week of what we found. Her access closed before she ever understood the full weight of what she'd sold. Minja stayed with me through every part of the unwinding, because loyalty for him was never complicated. And one evening in July, standing at my window, I looked down at the intersection where a gray sedan had once waited with such patience, and it was only ever a street again, just cars, just the ordinary indifferent motion of a city that never knew how close it had come to watching me choose the shorter, darker road. Amara found me there. "I never look at that intersection anymore," she told me. And just now I looked, and it was just an intersection. "You look different this year," she said, "from when I started. Cleaner, like something got resolved." "Some things did," I told her. She held my gaze the way she always had, the most honest thing about her. "Thank you," she said, "not for protecting me, for something more specific. You gave me back the belief that I could read people. After 4 years of telling myself I was wrong about everything, you were someone I was right about. I have built a great many things in my life that I was proud of at the time and ashamed of later." That sentence, from her, is the only thing I built that I have never once regretted. If there is a moral in any of this, it's the simplest one I know, and the hardest one I ever had to live by. That real power was never about what I could make disappear. It was about what I was finally willing to give up to keep one person safe, in the open, in the daylight, with nothing hidden behind me anymore. I'll ask you the same question I had to ask myself in that office at 4 a.m, with the city gray outside my window. If the version of your life you'd built for protection ever became the thing putting someone you loved in danger, would you have the discipline to tear it down before it cost you everything, or would you tell yourself one more time that it was still worth the price? Sit with that question. Then tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place, because I still think about it more nights than I don't. And if this story found you the way I hope it did, stay with me for the next one. There's always another door I haven't told you about yet.